Across history, civilizations have followed different paths, different cultures, environments, and technologies, yet their trajectories look strikingly similar. They rise, they expand, they reach peak complexity, stress accumulates, collapse follows. This is not coincidence, it is a pattern. If collapse follows a pattern, then it is not random, and if it is not random, then it can be understood, possibly even predicted. But this leads to a more difficult question. If we understand the pattern, why do civilizations continue to follow it? To answer that, we must move beyond theory and into real examples, into civilizations that rose, flourished, and fell, not as isolated stories, but as parts of a larger system, a system that connects them all, and possibly connects to us. Agar Arp Chaho, main Puri series isi clean, no filler cinematic format main, continue Karditahun. Agar Arp Chaho, main Puri series isi clean, no filler cinematic format main, continue Karditahun. The first cracks did not appear suddenly. They formed slowly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of what seemed like the world's first great success story. Mesopotamia, land between the rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates did more than sustain life, they created it. Here, for the first time in human history, scattered groups became organized society, agriculture flourished, cities rose, writing emerged, laws were codified, power became structured. It looked like the beginning of something permanent. But permanence was an illusion. The system that made Mesopotamia powerful was the same system that would eventually undermine it. Irrigation transformed dry land into fertile fields. Water was diverted, controlled, and distributed with increasing precision. Harvests expanded. Populations grew. Cities demanded more food, more land, more control. At first, the solution was simple: expand irrigation. But water, when controlled over long periods, carries consequences. The rivers brought not just life, but minerals. Salt accumulated in the soil. Year after year, invisible layers built up beneath the surface. Crops began to fail, slowly at first. Yields declined. Farmers adapted by switching crops, from wheat to more salt-resistant barley, but adaptation only delayed the inevitable. The land itself was changing. What once produced abundance began producing scarcity. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual degradation, an environmental shift driven by the very system designed to sustain growth. The more the civilization depended on irrigation, the more it accelerated the problem. And yet, the system continued. Because stopping was not an option. Cities depended on food, governments depended on surplus, power depended on stability. To reduce production would mean weakening the entire structure, so the system pushed forward even as the foundation beneath it eroded. This is the first pattern. Civilizations rarely reverse decisions that threaten their stability, even when those decisions are slowly destroying them. As agricultural output declined, pressure increased elsewhere, trade networks expanded to compensate, political structures became more centralized, control tightened, resources were redistributed with greater urgency. But these solutions introduced new vulnerabilities. Centralization made systems efficient but fragile. When authority is concentrated, failure at the top affects everything below. Governance becomes less adaptable. Decisions become slower, more rigid. Local problems become systemic crises. At the same time, competition intensified. Neighboring regions, facing similar pressures, began to conflict over resources. Water, land, and trade routes became points of tension. Conflict was not the cause of collapse. It was a symptom, a response to increasing scarcity within an already strained system. Over time, cities that once thrived began to weaken, infrastructure degraded, populations declined. Some settlements were abandoned entirely, others persisted, but at reduced scale and complexity. The system did not disappear overnight. It fragmented. This is the second pattern. Collapse is not always destruction. Often, it is simplification. A complex system breaks into smaller, less interconnected parts. What remains is not the civilization that once existed, but something more basic, more localized, and less powerful. In Mesopotamia, knowledge did not vanish completely. Agriculture continued, communities survived, but the large-scale, interconnected system that defined early civilization was gone. And with it, the illusion of permanence. What makes this collapse significant is not just that it happened, but how it happened. There was no single catastrophic event, no invasion that ended everything, no sudden disaster that explains the decline. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of stress. Environmental degradation, economic pressure, political centralization, resource competition. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, they created a system that could no longer sustain itself. And when the system reached its limit, it did what all complex systems do under sufficient strain. It collapsed. This pattern would repeat, in different forms, in different places, across different eras, but always with the same underlying structure. Growth leading to dependence. Dependence leading to vulnerability. Vulnerability leading to collapse. The story of Mesopotamia is not just the story of the first civilization. It is the first clear example of a pattern that would define all civilizations that followed. A pattern that does not depend on culture, technology, or geography. A pattern rooted in the nature of complex systems. And as history moved forward, that pattern would become more visible. Because the next civilizations would be larger, more powerful, more complex, and far more vulnerable. The Roman Empire did not begin with weakness. It began with expansion, rapid, strategic, and relentless. From a small city-state, Rome grew into a vast empire stretching across continents. Roads connected distant regions, trade flowed across thousands of miles, armies enforced order, laws unified diverse populations. It was a system of extraordinary scale. But scale introduces strain. To maintain control over such vast territory required constant input, resources, manpower, coordination. The military expanded not just to conquer, but to maintain borders. Administrative systems grew more complex to manage distant provinces. Communication slowed as distances increased. Efficiency gave way to burden. At its peak, Rome appeared invincible. Wealth flowed into the empire, cities thrived, infrastructure reached its highest level of development. But beneath that stability, pressure was building. Economic strain emerged as military costs increased. To sustain spending, currency was debased. The value of money declined. Inflation spread. Trust in the economic system weakened. At the same time, political instability intensified. Leadership changed rapidly. Power struggles became frequent. Decisions were driven less by long-term stability and more by immediate survival. The system was no longer operating for growth. It was operating to maintain itself. This is the third pattern. When systems shift from expansion to preservation, they become more fragile. Because preservation resists change, and resistance to change under pressure leads to failure. External threats did not cause Rome's collapse. They exposed it. Barbarian invasions, long portrayed as the decisive factor, were not overwhelming forces. They were manageable threats until the system could no longer respond effectively. Borders weakened, defense faltered, regions became isolated. The interconnected system began to break apart. And like Mesopotamia, Rome did not vanish instantly. It fragmented. The western half collapsed into smaller kingdoms. The eastern half, Byzantium, continued for centuries, but as a fundamentally different system. Complexity had been reduced. The pattern repeated. Different context. Same structure. And it did not end there. Across the ocean, another civilization followed a similar trajectory. The Maya developed one of the most advanced societies in the ancient world. Their cities were architectural achievements. Their understanding of astronomy was precise. Their agricultural systems supported large populations in challenging environments. But their success depended on environmental balance. Forests were cleared for agriculture. Water systems were carefully managed. Urban centers required constant resource input. Over time, that balance shifted. Evidence suggests prolonged droughts affected the region, water supplies diminished, agricultural output declined, population pressures increased. The system adapted temporarily. Reservoirs were expanded, farming intensified. But like Mesopotamia, adaptation accelerated the underlying problem. Environmental stress increased. Social stress followed. Cities were abandoned, populations declined, political structures collapsed. Once again, no single event explains the fall. Only the accumulation of stress within a complex system. Across these civilizations, separated by time and geography, the same structure emerges. Not identical events, not identical causes, but identical patterns. And that is the critical insight. Civilizations do not collapse because of specific events. They collapse because their structure makes them vulnerable to those events. The more complex the system, the more pathways exist for failure. The more interconnected the system, the faster failure spreads. The more optimized the system, the less adaptable it becomes. This is not a flaw unique to ancient societies. It is a property of all complex systems, including modern ones. Today's global civilization operates at a level of complexity far beyond anything in the past. Supply chains span continents, financial systems react in milliseconds, energy networks support billions of people simultaneously. This creates resilience in some ways, but it also creates unprecedented vulnerability. A disruption in one part of the system can propagate globally. Environmental changes affect multiple regions at once. Economic instability can spread rapidly across interconnected markets. The scale is larger. The speed is faster. But the pattern remains the same. Stress accumulates. Adaptation slows. Vulnerability increases. And eventually, the system approaches its threshold. The question is not whether modern civilization will face these pressures. It already is. The question is whether it will recognize the pattern before reaching the point where response is no longer possible. Because history does not repeat in exact form, but structure repeats with remarkable consistency. And that structure has already determined the fate of every civilization that came before. It is not written in events. It is written in systems. And systems, once pushed beyond their limits, do not negotiate. They respond in the only way they can. By collapsing, Rome did not fall in a single moment. It unfolded over centuries, like a structure slowly losing its internal strength while still standing on the surface. At its height, the Roman Empire was not just powerful, it was engineered for dominance. Roads connected provinces across continents. Law unified diverse populations under a single framework. Military discipline enforced stability across vast and culturally different regions. For a time, it worked with remarkable efficiency. But the same systems that created control also created dependency. Every province depended on Rome for protection. Every region depended on centralized administration for order. Every army depended on continuous funding from a growing economic base. As long as expansion continued, the system could sustain itself. Expansion was not just growth, it was fuel. And when expansion slowed, the system began to change its behavior. The first sign was economic strain. Maintaining a vast empire required enormous resources. Armies had to be paid, borders had to be defended, infrastructure had to be maintained, but the cost of maintaining this scale kept increasing. To compensate, the Roman state began to alter its currency. Silver content was reduced. More coins were produced with less actual value. In the short term, this allowed the system to continue functioning. But internally, trust began to weaken. When currency loses stability, every part of an economy feels the pressure. Prices rise, trade becomes uncertain, long-term planning becomes difficult, economic behavior shifts from growth to survival. This is one of the earliest indicators of systemic stress, when confidence replaces value. At the same time, political stability began to erode. Leadership became less consistent, power transitions grew more unstable, military influence over politics increased, emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. From a systems perspective, this is critical. Stability in complex systems depends on predictable leadership structures. When those structures become unstable, decision-making slows and contradictions increase. Rome was no longer acting as a unified system. It was becoming a collection of competing internal forces. And internal fragmentation is often more dangerous than external threats. Because external threats can be defended against. Internal fragmentation changes the system itself. As central authority weakened, regions began to operate more independently. Local leaders took more control. Loyalty shifted from empire to locality. Coordination across the empire became harder to maintain. The system was no longer synchronized. And when synchronization breaks in a complex network, efficiency collapses rapidly. This is not a dramatic collapse, it is a functional one. Trade routes became less reliable, communications slowed, military response times increased. Borders weakened not because enemies became stronger, but because coordination became weaker. External pressures, such as invasions, did not initiate collapse. They accelerated an existing internal decline. Germanic tribes crossing Roman borders were not an unprecedented threat. Rome had faced stronger enemies before, but by this stage, the system could no longer respond with the same efficiency. The defense network was fragmented, resources were strained, political unity was compromised. The system's reaction capacity had degraded. And in complex systems, the ability to respond is more important than the strength of individual components. As pressure increased, regions began to detach from central control. Some areas declared autonomy, others formed independent kingdoms. The western half of the empire gradually dissolved into smaller political units. This fragmentation is a key phase in systemic collapse. It is not destruction, it is decomposition. A once unified structure breaking into smaller, simpler systems that are more stable locally but far weaker globally. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for centuries, but it was no longer the same system. It had reduced in scale, simplified in structure, and narrowed in influence. Complexity had been reduced in order to survive. This pattern is consistent across all major civilizations. When systems exceed their sustainable complexity, they do not simply end, they simplify. The Maya civilization followed a similar trajectory in a very different environment. Large urban centers developed sophisticated architecture, astronomy, and agriculture. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul represented highly organized societies. But this complexity depended heavily on environmental stability. Deforestation altered local ecosystems, soil quality declined, water management systems became more stressed over time. Evidence suggests that prolonged droughts intensified these pressures. Again, the system did not collapse from a single cause. It reached a point where multiple stresses converged. Environmental pressure reduced agricultural output. Population demands increased strain on resources. Political competition intensified as control over resources became critical. As competition increased, cooperation decreased. And when cooperation breaks in a resource-limited system, fragmentation follows. Cities were gradually abandoned, populations declined, political structures dissolved, but culture and people did not disappear entirely. They relocated, adapted, and reorganized into smaller systems. Collapse, again, was not extinction. It was transformation into lower complexity. The same structural pattern appears in Mesopotamia, Rome, the Maya, and multiple other historical systems. The details differ. The mechanism remains consistent. Civilizations grow by increasing complexity. They sustain themselves through resource surplus and coordination. But over time, complexity introduces cost. When cost exceeds adaptability, stress accumulates. When stress exceeds tolerance, the system fragments. This is not a moral failure. It is not a consequence of poor leadership alone. It is a structural property of complex systems. The more advanced a system becomes, the more interconnected its components become. And the more interconnected a system becomes, the more pathways exist for failure. In early stages, redundancy provides safety. Multiple systems can compensate for each other. But as optimization increases, redundancy is often reduced for efficiency. Efficiency improves performance, but reduces resilience. This trade-off is central to understanding civilizational collapse. Modern global civilization is the most interconnected system in human history. Trade, communication, energy, and finance operate at planetary scale. This creates unprecedented capability, but also unprecedented dependency. A disruption in one critical node can propagate rapidly across the entire system. Economic shocks can spread across continents within hours. Environmental changes affect multiple regions simultaneously. Resource shortages can trigger cascading effects across interconnected networks. The system is efficient, but tightly coupled. And tightly coupled systems are sensitive to disruption. This does not mean collapse is imminent, but it does mean the underlying structural pattern still exists. Growth leads to complexity. Complexity leads to dependency. Dependency leads to vulnerability. And vulnerability under sustained stress leads to fragmentation. History does not move in cycles of exact repetition. Civilizations are not destined to follow identical paths. But systems governed by similar structural constraints tend to produce similar outcomes. The lesson from history is not inevitability. It is awareness. Civilizations do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because complexity grows faster than the ability to manage it. And when that gap becomes too large, even the most advanced systems begin to weaken from within. Rome did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was complex. And complexity, once it exceeds control, becomes its own form of pressure. A pressure that does not need an enemy to act, because it originates inside the system itself. Next, the Maya world did not collapse in a single coordinated event. It dissolved unevenly, city by city, region by region, over generations. At its peak, the Maya civilization represented one of the most sophisticated societies in the ancient world. Cities were dense, architecturally advanced, and deeply connected through trade and political alliances. Monumental pyramids rose above jungle canopies, aligned with astronomical precision. Calendrical systems tracked time with remarkable accuracy. Writing recorded dynasties, rituals, and political power. To an observer at the time, This was not a fragile system. It appeared highly organized, deeply structured, and culturally stable. But beneath that surface, the system was tightly bound to environmental conditions that were far less stable than its achievements suggested. Agriculture formed the foundation of Maya civilization. Unlike river-based systems such as Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Maya depended on rainfall and managed water through reservoirs, canals, and seasonal storage systems. This made them highly adaptive in normal conditions, but also highly vulnerable to prolonged disruption. When environmental balance shifted, the system had limited flexibility. Evidence from climate records suggests periods of extended drought affected the region during the Terminal Classic period. These droughts were not isolated events. They occurred in cycles, some lasting years, others spanning decades. At first, the system absorbed the stress. Water reservoirs were managed more intensively. Agricultural practices were adjusted. Local governance structures attempted to redistribute resources. Cities continued functioning, though under increasing pressure. But complex systems do not fail at the moment of stress. They fail when stress accumulates faster than adaptation. As drought conditions persisted, agricultural output declined. Population centers that depended on surplus production began to experience shortages. This created competition between regions that had previously been cooperative. In a stable system, cooperation is easy because surplus allows flexibility. In a stressed system, cooperation becomes costly because resources are limited. As scarcity increased, political fragmentation followed. City-states that had once been part of a broader network began to prioritize local survival. Alliances weakened. Rivalries intensified. Warfare between regions became more frequent, not necessarily because societies became more aggressive, but because resource competition left fewer alternatives. This is a critical transition point in systemic collapse. When cooperation breaks down, complexity becomes a burden rather than an advantage. Large systems require coordination, but coordination requires trust, stability, and surplus resources. When those conditions deteriorate, the system begins to fragment into smaller, more localized units. In the Maya region, this fragmentation was not uniform. Some cities declined earlier than others. Some regions adapted longer. Others shifted their centers of power entirely. There was no single fall, only gradual abandonment. Cities that once held tens of thousands of people were slowly emptied. Administrative centers lost influence. Monument construction slowed and eventually stopped. Written records declined, suggesting disruptions in political continuity. But importantly, the population did not disappear. People moved. They reorganized into smaller communities, often in less environmentally stressed areas. The civilization did not vanish. It transformed into lower density, less centralized forms of social organization. This is one of the most consistent features of civilizational collapse. It is rarely extinction. It is decomplexification. The reduction of scale, coordination, and centralization. A system that once operated at high complexity breaks into simpler, more localized systems that are easier to sustain under stress. From a systems perspective, this is not failure in a simple sense. It is a rebalancing. But it comes at a cost. Knowledge transmission becomes less efficient. Large-scale infrastructure is abandoned. Political integration disappears. Scientific and cultural development slows, not because knowledge is lost instantly, but because the systems that support its continuity weaken. What remains is continuity at a smaller scale, but discontinuity at a civilizational scale. The Maya case also highlights another important layer of systemic collapse: feedback loops. As environmental stress increased, agricultural decline led to social stress. Social stress led to political instability. Political instability further disrupted agricultural coordination. Each factor reinforced the others. This is known as a reinforcing feedback loop. Once such a loop begins, it accelerates system stress without requiring external input. The system begins to drive its own instability. This is why collapse often appears sudden, even when its origins are long-term. By the time visible breakdown occurs, the underlying structure has already been weakening for years or decades. When Spanish contact occurred centuries later, many of the major classic period Maya cities were already abandoned. The civilization had not experienced a single catastrophic endpoint. It had already transitioned into a different organizational form long before external contact. This distinction is important. Collapse is not always the end of a people or culture. It is often the end of a specific level of complexity. The underlying population, language families, and cultural practices may persist, but the large-scale structural system that defined the civilization changes fundamentally. The Maya collapse, therefore, reinforces a broader pattern seen across multiple historical systems. Civilizations grow by increasing complexity to manage environment, resources, and population. But increasing complexity introduces dependencies that reduce flexibility. When external conditions remain stable, complexity enables expansion. When conditions shift beyond adaptive capacity, complexity becomes a liability. Not because it is inherently negative, but because it requires sustained input to maintain. And when that input is disrupted, the system begins to contract. This contraction is not uniform. It is uneven, fragmented, and regionally variable. Some areas collapse faster. Some adapt longer. Some transform entirely. But the overall direction remains consistent: reduction in scale and complexity. What makes the Maya case particularly significant is its environmental sensitivity. Unlike river-based civilizations with relatively stable water sources, the Maya system was more directly exposed to climate variability. This increased both its adaptability in normal conditions and its vulnerability under extreme conditions. This dual nature is important in understanding all complex systems. Efficiency often comes at the cost of redundancy. And redundancy is what provides resilience under stress. When systems optimize for performance, they often reduce slack. But slack is what allows recovery. In modern terms, this is seen in many global systems today: economic, technological, and environmental. Highly optimized systems perform efficiently under normal conditions. But under disruption, they have limited buffer capacity. The Maya collapse does not provide a direct analogy to modern civilization, but it does reveal structural principles that remain relevant across time. Complex systems are not defined by their peak performance. They are defined by how they respond when conditions change. And history shows a consistent pattern. When stress exceeds adaptive capacity, systems do not simply fail. They reorganize into simpler forms. This is not the end of civilization as a concept, but it is the end of specific configurations of civilization. And each time this transition occurs, it reshapes the relationship between humans, environment, and structure. The Maya world did not disappear. It transformed. But in doing so, it left behind a clear record of how complexity behaves under pressure. A record that repeats across history, in different places, under different conditions, but always following the same underlying logic. Growth creates complexity. Complexity creates dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. And vulnerability, when pushed beyond tolerance, leads to fragmentation. The next systems in this historical sequence would not escape this pattern. They would scale it, expand it, and push it to even greater levels of intensity, until the question is no longer about ancient civilizations, but about the structure of civilization itself. Next, the Bronze Age world was not a single civilization. It was a tightly connected network of powerful states, each dependent on the others in ways that were not fully understood at the time. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Assyria, Babylon, and numerous smaller kingdoms spread across the eastern Mediterranean. On the surface, these were independent powers, competing, trading, and sometimes fighting, but beneath that surface, they were part of a deeply interconnected system. Trade routes carried copper, tin, grain, textiles, and luxury goods across vast distances. Diplomatic marriages linked royal families, treaties regulated borders, written correspondence maintained coordination between courts. This was not isolation. It was early globalization. And that interconnectedness created unprecedented prosperity. But it also created a hidden vulnerability. Because when systems become interconnected, they stop being independent. They become interdependent. And interdependence means that local failures can become system-wide disruptions. At first, the Bronze Age system appeared stable. Cities flourished, trade expanded, art, architecture, and writing systems developed rapidly. The level of cultural and technological sophistication reached heights never seen before in the region. But beneath this surface of stability, the system was operating with very little redundancy. Each region depended on others for essential resources. Egypt depended on imported timber. The Aegean depended on grain imports. Anatolia supplied critical metals like tin and copper, essential for bronze production. If any single component failed, the effects could spread quickly. This is the defining feature of tightly coupled systems. Efficiency increases, but resilience decreases. And when resilience is low, small disruptions can trigger large-scale consequences. The first signs of instability were subtle: trade disruptions in certain regions, localized conflicts, minor supply shortages. None of these were enough to threaten the system individually. But they began to interact. Then came environmental stress. Evidence from geological and archaeological records suggests a period of climate instability around the end of the late Bronze Age. Reduced rainfall in some regions led to agricultural decline. Food production became less reliable. Population centers began to feel pressure. At the same time, internal conflicts intensified. Competition over resources increased as surplus diminished. Regions that once cooperated began to prioritize local survival. The system was entering a critical phase. Because when a highly interconnected system experiences stress, the stress does not remain localized. It spreads. One disrupted trade route affects multiple kingdoms. One failed harvest affects food distribution across regions. One political conflict destabilizes diplomatic relationships that previously maintained balance. The system begins to lose synchronization. And synchronization is essential for complex coordination. Without it, efficiency collapses. The most widely discussed catalyst of the Bronze Age collapse is often the so-called Sea Peoples, groups that attacked multiple coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean. But viewing them as the primary cause is misleading. They were not the origin of collapse. They were a symptom of it. A system under stress becomes more vulnerable to migration, conflict, and opportunistic expansion. Groups that were once contained by stable borders become active when those borders weaken. In this sense, external pressure does not create collapse. It accelerates existing instability. As attacks increased and trade routes broke down, major cities began to fail. Ugarit, a major trading hub, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Mycenaean palaces were abandoned. Hittite administrative centers collapsed. Egypt survived, but was significantly weakened and entered a long period of decline. What is important is not just that these cities fell. It is how quickly the system unraveled once critical connections broke. Because once interdependence is disrupted, recovery becomes extremely difficult. Trade cannot resume without security. Security cannot be restored without resources. Resources cannot be gathered without trade. The system becomes locked in a downward cycle. This is the cascading nature of systemic collapse. Failure in one part of the system increases stress in another, which then feeds back into the system as a whole. Unlike isolated societies, interconnected civilizations do not fail gradually in isolated segments. They fail through network effects. The breakdown of one node weakens others, which then weakens the entire structure. And once enough connections fail, the system loses coherence. It stops functioning as a unified civilization and becomes fragmented regional systems again. This transition is not instantaneous. It unfolds over decades. But within historical records, it appears as a relatively rapid disappearance of entire cultural systems. Writing systems decline or disappear in some regions. Large architectural projects stop. Administrative continuity breaks down. Trade becomes local rather than international. The Bronze Age collapse marks one of the most significant systemic failures in human history, not because it destroyed civilization, but because it revealed how fragile interconnected complexity can be. After the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean did not remain in permanent ruin. New civilizations eventually emerged. Iron technology replaced bronze, new political structures formed, cultural systems evolved. But the scale and integration of the Bronze Age system was not immediately restored. It took centuries for comparable levels of complexity to re-emerge. This delay is significant. It shows that collapse does not reset systems instantly to zero, but it resets complexity to a lower baseline from which recovery must begin. Each collapse in history therefore functions as both an ending and a reset, not of humanity itself, but of the scale at which human systems can operate. And across Mesopotamia, Rome, the Maya world, and the Bronze Age network, the same structural principles appear again and again. Systems grow. Systems optimize. Systems interconnect. Systems lose redundancy. Systems accumulate stress. Systems fragment, not because of a single failure point, but because of accumulated structural pressure within complexity itself. This raises a deeper question that moves beyond individual civilizations. If this pattern repeats across time, geography, and culture, then it is not specific to any one society. It is a property of complex systems themselves, which means the focus should not only be on what caused past collapses, but on how complexity behaves under sustained pressure. Because once systems reach a certain level of interconnectedness, they begin to follow similar structural rules. Rules that do not depend on intention, only on structure. And structure, once established, does not require awareness to operate. It simply continues until it can no longer sustain itself. And when that point is reached, the system does not ask for permission to change. It changes on its own, in the only direction that remains available, into fragmentation. Next, after the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world did not return to its previous state. It reorganized. New powers emerged. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant material for tools and weapons, changing the balance of military and economic power. smaller. More localized societies replaced the large interconnected palace systems that had defined the earlier age. This transition is important because it reveals something often missed in discussions of collapse. Systems do not simply disappear, they reconfigure under new constraints. But the level of complexity achieved during the Late Bronze Age was not immediately restored. Trade networks became shorter, political systems became less centralized, writing systems disappeared in some regions and reappeared later in different forms. For several centuries, the system operated at a lower level of integration. This period is sometimes misunderstood as a dark age, but in systems terms, it is more accurately described as a phase of reduced complexity following systemic overload. The question is not why civilizations stopped. The question is why it changed shape. To understand this, we must return to the structure beneath all previous collapses. Because across Mesopotamia, Rome, the Maya world, and the Bronze Age system, a consistent pattern continues to emerge. Civilizations grow by increasing complexity in response to environmental and social demands. Early on, this complexity is highly effective. It allows coordination at larger scales, supports population growth, and enables technological advancement. But complexity is not free. Every added layer, administration, infrastructure, military organization, trade regulation, requires energy to maintain. This energy comes from surplus production within the system. As long as surplus is high, complexity can expand without visible strain. But over time, two things begin to change simultaneously. First, the cost of maintaining complexity increases. Second, the marginal benefit of adding additional complexity decreases. This creates a narrowing gap between input and output. At first, the gap is barely noticeable. The system continues to function efficiently, growth appears stable, expansion continues. But beneath the surface, the balance is shifting. More resources are required to maintain existing structures. Less benefit is gained from new expansion. This is the beginning of systemic stress accumulation. It is rarely visible in real time because complex systems are designed to absorb fluctuations. Redundancies exist, buffers exist, local adaptations compensate for regional failures. But these buffers are not infinite. And when multiple small stresses occur simultaneously, they begin to interact. Environmental variation reduces agricultural stability. Economic pressure increases competition for resources. Political systems become more rigid in an attempt to maintain control. Each of these responses is rational in isolation, but collectively they reduce system flexibility. And flexibility is what allows adaptation. As flexibility decreases, the system becomes more sensitive to external shocks. This is the critical transition point from resilient complexity to fragile complexity. A resilient system can absorb disruption and recover. A fragile system may remain stable for long periods, but once disturbed beyond a threshold, it breaks rapidly. This is why collapses often appear sudden, even when the underlying causes are long-term. The system is slowly losing its capacity to absorb stress, until it reaches a tipping point. At that point, even minor disturbances can trigger cascading failures. One region experiences resource shortages. Trade routes are disrupted. Neighboring regions lose access to essential goods. Political authority weakens as central coordination fails. Local conflicts increase as competition intensifies. Each failure reinforces the next. This is not linear decline. It is network collapse. A network collapse behaves differently from isolated failure. In isolated systems, damage remains contained. In interconnected systems, damage spreads. This is why highly advanced civilizations are not necessarily more stable than simpler ones. In fact, the opposite can be true, because higher complexity often means higher interdependence. And interdependence increases vulnerability to cascading failure. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrated this clearly, but the same structure appears in later systems as well. Rome's vast administrative and economic network functioned efficiently for centuries, but as internal pressures increased and external conditions changed, coordination across the empire became increasingly difficult. Local regions began to operate independently. Central authority weakened. The system fragmented. The Maya civilization experienced similar dynamics, though under different environmental conditions. Resource stress, climate variation, and political competition combined to reduce system stability. Cities were abandoned, not all at once, but progressively. In each case, the pattern remains consistent. Growth creates complexity. Complexity creates dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. Vulnerability, under sustained stress, leads to fragmentation. This pattern is not dependent on geography, culture, or technology. It emerges from the structure of complex adaptive systems themselves, which raises a more fundamental question. If this pattern is structural, not historical, then it is not limited to ancient civilizations. It applies to any system that grows in complexity beyond a certain threshold, including modern global systems. Today's world operates at an unprecedented level of interconnection. Economic systems are global. Supply chains span continents. Communication networks operate in real time across the planet. This level of integration provides enormous capability, but it also creates tight coupling between systems. And tightly coupled systems behave differently under stress than loosely connected ones. In tightly coupled systems, failures propagate faster. Buffers are smaller. Recovery is more dependent on coordination across multiple layers simultaneously. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that the same structural principles observed in historical systems still apply. The key difference is scale. Modern systems are larger, faster, and more interconnected than anything in history, which means both resilience and vulnerability are amplified. The same structure that enables global coordination also enables global propagation of disruption. History does not provide a simple prediction of the future, but it does provide a framework for understanding structural behavior. And that framework is consistent. Complex systems grow. They optimize. They interconnect. They reduce redundancy. They increase efficiency. They accumulate stress. And under sufficient pressure, they reorganize into simpler forms. Not because collapse is desired, but because it is the only stable configuration remaining under the given constraints. This is the hidden logic behind civilizational change. Not destiny, not punishment, not random catastrophe, but structural transformation driven by the internal dynamics of complexity itself. And every civilization that has ever reached a high level of organization has faced this same underlying pressure. In different forms, at different times, but always following the same fundamental structure, which brings the analysis back to its central insight. Civilizations do not fail randomly. They follow patterns embedded in the systems that define them. And those patterns do not disappear over time. They persist until they are understood well enough to be managed, or until they repeat once again under new conditions. The question then is not whether the pattern exists, It is how long a system can grow before that pattern becomes unavoidable.